Legend says it began with a cup of tea. Somewhere around 2700 BCE, a Chinese empress named Lei Zhu was sitting beneath a mulberry tree when a small white cocoon dropped out of the branches and into her hot tea. As she tried to lift it out, a single fine thread began to unravel from it, and kept unraveling, far longer than anything that small should have been able to hold. That thread, according to the legend, was the beginning of silk, and by the time she'd finished unwinding it, the story goes, she had enough to see that it could be woven into something far more useful than a curiosity floating in a teacup. The real history is older and far less romantic. Long before any empress and her tea, people in China were already boiling these same cocoons alive, by the billion, to keep that one continuous thread from ever breaking. They still are, today, at an industrial scale that legend never had to account for.
Somewhere between a mulberry tree and a modern operating room, the exact same insect that gets boiled by the billions every year to make a scarf or a necktie is now stitching closed the incisions of major surgery, was once the only material trusted to carry a soldier safely out of a burning aircraft, and was stolen once, smuggled across an entire continent inside a hollow bamboo cane to bring down an empire's trade monopoly. This is the story of how one of the oldest luxuries in human history never stopped evolving, and why the thread inside a cocoon turned out to be worth so much more than anyone in ancient China could have imagined. Start with the raw size of this industry today. The world produced roughly 94,000 tons of raw silk in 2024, and that number is still climbing, up about 1.5% from the year before. China alone accounts for close to 49,000 tons of it, over 70% of everything the planet produces, making it the undisputed center of global silk in volume, in infrastructure, and in export reach. India comes in a distant second at around 36,000 tons a year, and Romania a distant third at roughly 2,100 tons. Between just those three countries, that's 93% of the entire world's silk supply. And the concentration in China and India alone is still increasing, not spreading out. Now zoom into what that tonnage actually costs in raw material, because the math here is almost absurd. It takes roughly 5,500 individual cocoons to produce a single kilogram of raw silk, and somewhere between 6 and 9 kilograms of raw cocoons are needed just to yield that 1 kilogram of usable, reeled silk yarn. A single silk saree, one garment, worn once to a wedding, requires somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 silkworms killed in the process of making it. Multiply that by a global industry producing tens of thousands of tons a year, and you're talking about a number of individual insect lives that's almost impossible to hold in your head at once, feeding an industry that shows no sign of slowing down. Think about what that means at the scale of a single garment. A silk saree is the accumulated output of somewhere between 5 and 10,000 individual living cocoons, each one raised from an egg, each one fed mulberry leaves for weeks, each one spinning for 3 uninterrupted days, all of it converging into a few meters of fabric worn for a single wedding and then folded away. Nobody wearing it is usually thinking about that math. The industry generating $41.4 billion by 2033 depends on nobody having to. Here's what makes that math even stranger. Each one of those cocoons is built from a single, unbroken filament of silk protein. Not a woven mesh, not a bundle of short fibers, but one continuous thread, commonly measured at up to 900 meters long, spun by one insect in the space of about 3 days. Some measurements push that even higher, but even at the more conservative figure, that's roughly the height of 2.5 Eiffel Towers stacked on top of each other, produced by a single caterpillar working non-stop inside a cocoon barely the size of a peanut. And every one of those threads, every single one, only stays unbroken because of what happens next, which is precisely the wall this industry has been running into for over 4,000 years. Behind those tonnage figures is an enormous number of actual human hands. In India alone, sericulture currently employs somewhere around 9.76 million people in rural and semi-urban areas, spread across more than 52,000 villages, making it one of the largest rural employment generators in the country's entire agricultural sector. Producing a single kilogram of raw silk generates roughly 11 days of labor, and just 1 acre of mulberry cultivation can employ 5 people full-time, year-round. Accessible enough that a family can start rearing silkworms on as little as 3/4 of an acre and sustain itself without hiring outside help. Women make up roughly 60% of that workforce, working across the entire chain from tending the mulberry orchards to sorting the finished cocoons.
China's silk sector, more industrialized and mechanized, employs a comparatively smaller million or so workers for a much larger tonnage output. 2 very different models of the same industry, running side by side, each one perfectly suited to the economy that built it, and neither one obviously more efficient than the other, once you account for what each is actually optimizing for. The entire global market built around this fragile miracle of one continuous thread is projected to reach $41.4 billion by 2033, something a Chinese empress supposedly discovered by accident under a mulberry tree is now a multi-billion-dollar global industry, employing millions of people directly, still expanding, still overwhelmingly concentrated in the same 2 countries that have dominated it for most of recorded history.
Here is the problem silk has never been able to engineer its way around. The entire value of a cocoon depends on that filament staying in one unbroken piece, and nature has other plans for it. Left alone, the pupa inside a cocoon eventually matures into a moth, and when it's ready to emerge, it doesn't gently untie the silk around it. It forces its way out, biting and pushing through the fibers, snapping that one long, continuous thread into dozens or hundreds of short, tangled fragments in the process. A broken filament is a different, much cheaper product, sold into a lower tier of the market at a lower price. Short, broken fibers have to be spun together like cotton or wool, using a completely different process that produces a coarser, duller, weaker thread. The luxurious, smooth, lustrous silk that took 4,000 years to build a global reputation around depends entirely on that one filament surviving all the way from the cocoon to the reel, fully intact, without a single moth ever getting the chance to hatch. Which means the entire silk industry, from its earliest recorded history to the factories running today, has been built around a single, uncomfortable requirement. The moth has to be stopped before it can wake up and ruin the very thing it spent 3 days building. Timing that requirement precisely is its own quiet engineering problem. Wait too long, and the moth develops far enough to bite through the filament regardless of what happens next. The cocoon is ruined before anyone even reaches for the steam. Act too early, and the pupa inside hasn't finished the transformation that gives the finished cocoon its full strength and quality, producing a thinner, weaker filament than a fully mature one would have.
Every single cocoon across an industry now producing 94,000 tons of silk a year is running on that same narrow window, not measured in days, but in the final hours before a moth would otherwise have opened its own wings for the first and only time. The way that requirement gets met is where the story stops being romantic. To keep the filament from breaking, the pupa inside each cocoon is killed with steam or hot air, timed precisely before the moth inside is developed enough to bite its way out. This is the central act of the entire process, not an unfortunate side effect of it. Every kilogram of conventional silk on Earth exists because that step happened first, on an industrial scale, to make sure nothing inside the cocoon ever got the chance to move again. That tension between what the industry needs and what it costs has apparently existed for a very long time.
Even the legendary origin story carries a strange asymmetry. An empress marvels at the beauty of an accidentally unraveling thread, but the story rarely lingers on what that unraveling actually required. Archaeological evidence pushes the real origins of Chinese silk cultivation back even further than the Lei Zhu legend, to fragments of primitive silk fabric dated to roughly 3,600 BCE, nearly 900 years before the empress and her cup of tea supposedly happened at all. However far back it goes, the same basic trade-off was already baked into the process from the very beginning. An entire luxury industry, built silently on top of a step nobody particularly wanted to look at too closely. By the 2nd century BCE, that luxury had become valuable enough to build an entire trade network around. The Silk Road connected China to the rest of Asia, and eventually the Mediterranean world, carrying silk across thousands of miles of desert and mountain, alongside spices, metals, and ideas.
For centuries, China guarded the actual techniques of silk production as closely as a modern trade secret, turning a single insect's spinning habit into one of the most sought-after luxury goods in the ancient world, traded, taxed, fought over, and in some accounts, valued at close to its weight in gold. Silk didn't just represent wealth in ancient China. For long stretches of its history, it functioned as actual money. Starting under the Han Dynasty, plain, undyed bolts of silk were used alongside coins and grain to pay soldiers stationed in remote regions where coin currency barely reached at all. By the Tang Dynasty, the system had been formalized further, with standardized bolts of silk, roughly 56 centimeters wide, explicitly recognized as legal currency for trade, tribute, and tax payment, a fabric literally serving as cash, centuries before paper money existed anywhere in the world. Nobody outside China was supposed to know how it was really made.
What nobody outside China needed to know either was the part of the process that happened just before the thread was ever pulled free. The secret held for the better part of 1,000 years, until it didn't. In 552 CE, according to the historical account, 2 monks approached the Byzantine Emperor Justinian with an offer. In exchange for his backing, they would travel into Central Asia and bring back the one thing Rome had been buying from China at enormous expense for generations, without ever knowing how it was actually made. Adult silkworms don't survive being transported. They're fragile, temperature-sensitive, and short-lived. So instead of trying to smuggle out live moths, the monks smuggled out silkworm eggs and young larvae, hidden inside hollow bamboo canes, and carried them roughly 2 years back along a northern route skirting the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Whatever they were promised, it worked.
2 years is a long time to carry something that fragile across mountains and desert without it dying in transit or being discovered at a border crossing. Either failure would have meant the mission simply evaporated, unrecorded. One more failed gamble in a long history of failed attempts to break China's monopoly. This one didn't fail. Those smuggled eggs became the foundation of an entirely new, homegrown Byzantine silk industry, and China's centuries-long monopoly on the one material every empire around it wanted was over within a single generation. Undone not by war or diplomacy, but by 2 men and a hollow stick of bamboo. The industry nearly collapsed just a few centuries later, and the person who saved it had never worked with an insect in his life. In 1865, a disease tore through silkworm populations across France, then spread into Italy, Austria, and parts of Asia Minor, wiping out entire regional economies built on sericulture as it went.
Desperate, the French government turned to a chemist mainly known at the time for his work on fermentation, Louis Pasteur, who by his own account had no real experience with silkworms or with animals of any kind. Pasteur spent 5 years on the problem anyway, from 1865 to 1870, and eventually identified the culprit under a microscope. Not one disease, but 2 separate parasitic infections, one of them, pebrine, leaving visible, shiny corpuscles inside infected worms, hereditary and contagious at the same time. His solution was almost bureaucratic in its simplicity. Screen the egg-laying mobs under a microscope, cull any batch showing signs of infection, and only breed forward from confirmed disease-free stock. It worked well enough to save the French silk industry outright, and the same screening principle, born from a scientist who wasn't even supposed to be the one solving this, is still recognizable in how healthy breeding stock gets selected today. That silence has broken down completely in the last few decades, and once it did, the questions that followed were not easy ones. Killing a living creature to preserve a single thread is, at minimum, a real and reasonable point of ethical debate. Insects are not mammals, and reasonable people disagree about where the line for animal welfare actually falls. But a debate about it clearly exists, and it hasn't gone away. It isn't only the silkworms that pay a physical cost either. The workers who reel silk by hand, dipping cocoons in near boiling water to loosen the filament, commonly report burns, dermatitis, and other skin infections from constant contact with the heat and the water. Eye irritation, back pain, and repetitive strain injuries from the reeling motion itself are documented as well. Hours a day spent hunched over steaming water, hands moving the same practiced motion thousands of times, in an industry that has run this way for most of its 4,000-year history.
In the early 1990s, a government sericulture officer in Andhra Pradesh, India, named Kusuma Rajaya, decided he'd had enough of that trade-off. Inspired directly by Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of ahimsa, non-violence toward all living things, Rajaya worked out a method of harvesting silk cocoons only after the moth inside had already emerged naturally, instead of killing the pupa to stop it. The resulting fabric became known as Ahimsa silk, or peace silk, a version of one of history's oldest luxury goods, reworked specifically so that nothing inside the cocoon had to die to produce it. It would be tidy to end this beat there, with the ethical problem solved and a clean alternative sitting on the shelf next to the conventional product. It isn't that simple, and the honest version of this story has to say so.
The moths used to produce ahimsa silk have been selectively bred for generations, specifically to produce high-quality cocoons, and as a direct consequence of that same breeding, they typically can't fly, can barely move once they emerge, and don't live very long, regardless of whether they're allowed to hatch naturally or not. Peace silk avoids the single most visible and direct harm in the traditional process. It does not undo everything that came before it, or escape what centuries of breeding this insect for human use has already done to the animal itself. There is one variety that gets closer to a clean answer, though it comes from a different species altogether. Eri silk, spun by the moth Samia cynthia racini, builds a cocoon that is naturally open-ended. The moth was never going to be trapped inside it in the first place, with or without human intervention. No steaming, no boiling, no killing step of any kind is required to harvest it, which makes Eri the only commercially produced silk on Earth that's non-violent by the basic biology of the insect itself, not by a modified version of the conventional process. The trade-off is a mechanical one rather than an ethical one. Because the moth has already broken the cocoon open on its way out, there's no single unbroken filament left to reel. Eri silk has to be spun from short fibers instead, the same way cotton or wool is, which produces a warmer, denser, slightly coarser fabric than the smooth, reeled luxury silk the rest of this industry is built around. 4,000 years into this industry, there still isn't one version of silk that gets to call itself simple. Only different points along the same trade-off between what the fiber costs to produce and what it feels like in your hands afterward.
Not every regional silk variety is defined by that same ethical trade-off either. Some are simply strange in their own right. Muga silk, woven exclusively in Assam, India, for more than 7,000 years, and once reserved for the royalty of the Ahom dynasty, carries a natural golden yellow shine that can't be bleached or dyed out of it. Its low porosity means the color is locked in permanently, and unlike almost every other textile fiber on Earth, Muga actually grows more lustrous with age and repeated washing rather than fading. It's been under formal geographical indication protection since 2007, specifically to stop counterfeit Muga from being sold under its name. 4,000 years of the same basic biology, and the industry still hasn't run out of variations on it. Whichever ethical path a producer chooses, the mechanical process underneath it is almost identical, and it starts long before there's a cocoon to argue about at all. It starts with mulberry trees. Silkworm farming, known as sericulture, actually begins with an entire separate branch of agriculture called moriculture, growing mulberry trees specifically to keep silkworms fed, since the domesticated silk moth caterpillar, Bombyx mori, will eat almost nothing else. White mulberry is the species most commonly planted for this purpose, in orchards whose entire economic purpose is to feed an insect rather than to produce fruit for people. From there, the silkworm's life runs through 4 stages: egg, larva, pupa, and moth, completing the whole cycle in roughly 45 to 55 days under normal conditions. For most of that time, the larva does nothing but eat mulberry leaves and grow, shedding its skin several times as it does, each molt leaving it visibly larger than before, until it reaches the point where its body is finally ready to spin. A silkworm at that stage can eat through a genuinely startling quantity of mulberry leaf relative to its own size, which is exactly why an entire branch of agriculture exists solely to keep it fed. Spinning itself takes about 3 days, worked without pause. The larva produces a continuous strand of liquid protein from glands near its mouth, laying it down around itself in a tight figure-8 pattern, over and over, building outward to inward until it's completely enclosed. The moment that liquid protein meets open air, it solidifies into fiber. The same fiber that, laid down in one uninterrupted 3-day session, adds up to that single unbroken filament up to 900 meters long. Once the cocoon is finished, the clock starts running on the industry's central, unavoidable problem. Before the pupa inside can mature far enough to chew its way out and shred the filament, the cocoons are exposed to steam or hot air, killing the pupa in place. What comes next is reeling. Cocoons are dropped into hot water to loosen the saracen, the natural gum that holds the outer strands of the cocoon together, and the loosened end of the filament is found and drawn out. Because a single filament is too fine to use on its own, thinner than a human hair, easily snapped by hand. Several filaments from several cocoons, usually somewhere between 5 and 8 of them, are reeled simultaneously and twisted together into one working strand of raw silk thread, strong enough at that point to survive weaving, dyeing, and everyday wear. In a modern mechanized facility, this happens on continuously running reeling machines, tending dozens of basins of hot water at once. Done by hand, the same job is unmistakably a craft, requiring a worker's eye to catch the loosened end of each filament and feed it into the twist at exactly the right moment, over and over, cocoon after cocoon, all day. The raw silk that comes off the reel still isn't finished. It goes through degumming next, a further wash that strips away the remaining saracen still coating the fiber, leaving behind the soft, smooth, genuinely lustrous material that gives silk its reputation, ready at that point to be dyed and woven into whatever it's actually going to become. Watch that whole sequence from one end to the other, and almost nothing about the material looks the same at any 2 stages. It goes in as a dry, papery, slightly lumpy cocoon, barely bigger than a thumb, the color of raw cotton. It comes out of the hot water reeling bath as a wet, near-invisible strand, thinner than a human hair, that has to be caught by eye and by touch before it can be wound onto a reel at all. After degumming, that same strand turns soft, faintly glossy, and noticeably lighter. Silk loses somewhere around 1/4 of its weight in the degumming process alone, the saracen gum accounting for that much of the raw fiber's original mass. What's left afterward barely resembles the stiff little shell it started as only days earlier, and every kilogram of it took roughly 11 days of human labor somewhere along that chain to reach this point, from mulberry leaf to finished thread. 1 kilogram of finished silk, in other words, can come from 2 almost unrecognizably different places. In China, that kilogram is far more likely to have come out of a large, mechanized reeling facility, part of an industrial sector employing roughly 1 million workers total to produce close to 49,000 tons a year. Enormous output per worker, built on scale and automation. In India, that same kilogram is far more likely to trace back to a single small farming family working 3/4 of an acre of mulberry, part of a workforce nearly 10 times larger producing barely 3/4 of China's tonnage. Enormous output per person employed, built on millions of small, distributed livelihoods rather than a smaller number of large facilities. Neither model has replaced the other. 4,000 years after Lezu's legendary cocoon, the same fiber is still being produced 2 completely different ways by 2 neighboring countries at the same time. For most of the last 4,000 years, whatever it's going to become meant fabric, clothing, banners, and, for a surprisingly long stretch of the 20th century, parachutes. Silk's combination of lightweight and real strength made it the standard material for military parachutes for decades, most of it imported from Japan, until the Second World War cut off that supply and forced a switch to DuPont's new synthetic fiber, nylon, first tested as a parachute material in 1942 and standard issue for American and British forces by the war's second half. It's one of the few times in this story where silk lost a fight to a competitor outright, and it's worth remembering that loss now, because the next turn in this story is silk fighting back into a field nobody expected it to return to. That field is surgery, and silk getting there is less an invention than a homecoming. Long before suffragan or soft silk, ancient Egyptian physicians were already documenting wound suturing techniques as far back as roughly 3000 BCE, recorded in one of the oldest surviving medical texts in the world, the Edwin Smith Papyrus. By around 500 BCE, the Indian physician Sushruta, often called the father of surgery, was explicitly describing the use of silk thread to close wounds in his own medical writings. Centuries later, the Greek physician Galen of Pergamon was using silk alongside catgut made from twisted animal intestine to stitch the torn tendons of wounded gladiators back together. The same fiber a moth spins around itself to survive metamorphosis has been closing human wounds, in one form or another, for roughly 2,500 years, which makes its modern return in FDA-cleared sutures and vocal cord injections look less like an invention and more like the oldest trick in medicine, simply catching back up with the material science to do it properly. There's a smaller twist hiding inside that same story. Saracen, the sticky gum washed away and discarded during degumming, treated for most of silk's history as pure waste, turns out to be valuable in its own right.
Modern cosmetic research has found saracen to be a strong, natural humectant, meaning it holds moisture against the skin and slows water loss, alongside documented antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, and photoprotective properties. It's now being reclaimed from what used to be simple wastewater and formulated directly into moisturizers, shampoos, and anti-aging creams. Silk's own leftover byproduct becoming a skincare ingredient in exactly the same decade that silk fibro itself was becoming a surgical material. In the last few decades, that stopped being the interesting part of the story. Silk fibroin, the core structural protein that makes up the filament itself, separate from the saracen washed away in processing, turns out to have a set of properties that read almost like a wish list for a biomedical material.
It has high mechanical strength for its weight, low immunogenicity, meaning the body's immune system tends not to attack it, low general toxicity, and it's fully biodegradable and biocompatible, breaking down inside the body into components it can safely absorb. It's also highly permeable to water vapor, a property that matters enormously for anything meant to sit on or inside living tissue. Skin and internal tissue both need to breathe even while healing, and a material sealing a wound shut that can't let moisture pass through it tends to do more harm than good. None of that biological wish list was discovered recently either. Silk fibroin has been studied for its biomedical potential for decades, with the pace of new applications only accelerating as material science has caught up with what the fiber could already do. Regulators noticed. The FDA has recognized silk fibroin as generally recognized as safe for food applications, and separately, it's listed in pharmacopoeias as an approved biomaterial for surgical sutures and certain medical devices. Silk, in other words, sewing wounds shut using the exact same fiber it's been used to make scarves out of for 4 millennia. Commercial silk sutures already exist under real product names on hospital shelves today, including soft silk and permahand, the same braided fiber structure that made silk prized for clothing, a strong, flexible, multi-filament strand, turns out to translate directly into a suture material surgeons can knot securely and rely on to hold under tension. In 2018, the FDA went a step further and approved an injectable silk fibroin product from a company called Sofragen, designed to treat vocal cord medialization and insufficiency, a real, dated regulatory milestone for an ancient material finding a strange, thoroughly modern use inside the human throat.
Beyond what's already approved and on the shelf, researchers are actively working on considerably stranger applications, none of them commercial products yet, but all of them documented, ongoing lines of research. Silk-based scaffolds are being developed as a structural base for tissue engineering, frameworks doctors hope could eventually help regenerate bone, cartilage, skin, corneal tissue, nerve tissue, and even torn anterior cruciate ligaments, giving a patient's own cells something biocompatible to hold onto and grow across while the silk itself slowly biodegrades and disappears, leaving nothing foreign behind once the job is done. That biodegradation is exactly what makes silk useful for the second major research direction as well, drug delivery.
Because silk fibroin breaks down at a predictable, controllable rate, researchers are exploring it as a carrier that can hold medication and release it slowly over time, rather than all at once. including formulations engineered to be inhaled directly into the lungs, a use for spider-thin cocoon fiber that has nothing to do with weaving anything at all. None of that erases the reeling rooms, the steam, or the ethical weight sitting underneath all of it. But it does mean the same insect that's been boiled by the billion for thousands of years to make banners and neckties is now, in parallel, being engineered into something that might one day help regrow a joint, rebuild a cornea, or carry medicine slowly into a body that needs it, using nothing more exotic than a protein a caterpillar has been making for free since long before humans existed to make use of it. Pull all of it back together, and the distance covered is genuinely strange to sit with. A single cocoon, spun by one caterpillar in 3 unbroken days, produces one continuous thread up to 900 meters long. It takes 5,500 of those cocoons to make a single kilogram of silk, roughly 11 days of human labor along the way. And an industry built on exactly that math now employs something like 9.76 million people in India alone, worth an estimated $41.4 billion globally and still growing through 2033. That same fragile thread has already been stolen once, carried 2 years across a continent inside hollow bamboo canes to break an empire's monopoly. It's been woven into parachutes that carried soldiers safely out of burning aircraft, right up until a synthetic competitor finally beat it on that particular job in 1942. It was closing human wounds 2,500 years before anyone thought to put a corporate name on the thread doing it. Sushruta describing it in India, Galen stitching gladiators back together in Greece, and it is, right now, sitting inside an FDA-approved injectable product treating damaged vocal cords, under a brand name that didn't exist a decade ago. Very few materials in human history get to be simultaneously the oldest and the newest thing in the room. And yet, for all of that history and all of those billions of dollars, silk remains almost invisible next to the rest of the textile world. Global fiber production across every material, cotton, polyester, wool, everything, reached about 132 million tons in 2024. Silk's roughly 94,000 tons of that total works out to well under 0.1% of everything the world weaves. It is, by raw volume, one of the smallest fibers on the planet, propped up almost entirely by 4,000 years of reputation, rather than by any real share of the market it supposedly built. It is still, underneath all of that, exactly what it always was, an industry that runs, for the overwhelming majority of its output, on killing an insect before it can wake up, weighed against everything humans have found a way to build from the thread it leaves behind. Ahimsa silk offers a partial answer to that, not a complete one. A real alternative with a real, documented cost of its own, still tangled up in generations of breeding this animal specifically for human use. Eri silk gets closer still, the one variety where nothing has to die at all, at the cost of the single, unbroken filament that makes reeled silk what it is. 4,000 years in, silk still hasn't produced one version of itself that's fully comfortable to look at directly, even as it keeps finding stranger and more valuable places to end up. It's worth remembering, before closing this out, that none of this, the empresses, the smuggled eggs, the sutures, the FDA approvals, required silk to be reinvented even once. Every modern use traces back to the same 3-day spinning act, the same figure-8 pattern, the same single filament a caterpillar builds purely to survive its own metamorphosis. Humans didn't design silk, they just kept finding new reasons to want it. There's something worth sitting with in the fact that the very same tension, one continuous thread, and what it costs to keep it that way, has run underneath this industry since long before anyone was writing any of it down. An empress marvels at a thread unraveling into her tea. 2 monks cross a continent with stolen eggs hidden in bamboo, gambling 2 years of their lives on an emperor's vague promise. A worker's hands blister from the same hot water her ancestors used, thousands of years and thousands of miles removed from any legend. A pilot, a century ago, trusts the same fiber to open cleanly above a burning aircraft, right up until something newer and cheaper finally does the job better. And a surgeon, right now, tonight, somewhere, is closing an incision with a descendant of that exact same thread,
Inside a material the FDA has approved for the inside of a human body. Closing a wound with silk exactly the way Sushruta described doing it 2,500 years ago, just with better tools and a company name attached to it. None of those moments cancel each other out.
They're all just true at the same time, stacked on top of one unbroken filament that a caterpillar built for entirely different reasons than any of the people who ended up using it. Reasons that had nothing to do with empires, or luxury, or surgery, and everything to do with surviving 3 days long enough to become a moth. Sometimes, the oldest luxury in the world turns out to still be evolving, 4,000 years after it supposedly started with an accident under a mulberry tree. And it still hasn't finished deciding what it wants to become next. A scarf, a suture, a scaffold for someone's own regrowing cartilage, or something nobody working in a lab today has thought to try yet. If stories like this, where the oldest, most familiar materials turn out to have the strangest second lives, are your kind of thing, subscribe and we'll see you in the next one.